Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring healing intention. With me is Stephan Schwartz, who is one of the founders of the International Society for Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine. For 2 years, he was the editor of the journal Subtle Energies. He is also a columnist for the journal Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing. In addition, Stephan is a parapsychology researcher and the author of several books, including The Secret Vaults of Time, The Alexandria Project, Opening to the Infinite, and The 8 Laws of Change. Welcome, Stephan.
Pleasure.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yes.
And it's really interesting to me how many areas you cover in your background, all the way from anthropology and archaeology and remote viewing to a very serious interest in healing intention.
Yes.
And the thing that really intrigues me about healing intention is that, well, there's self-healing, there's healing of others, and also at the social level.
Yes, I think, what originally attracted me to therapeutic intention, healing, was that it was, speaking anthropologically, it is one of the oldest and most universal human beliefs. Almost every religion in the world, across all the geography of the world and all of the cultures of the world, has the idea that consciousness can affect the well-being of another, usually through the intermediation of a deity or a spirit, but I just see that as a way of describing the great unity of non-local consciousness.
Well, I think sometimes healers feel uncomfortable taking personal credit, and it's much easier if they say I have an angel who does it.
Yes, exactly. I think you're quite right. It seems presumptuous to believe that you can do it, and actually my view of therapeutic intention, which has gone through a lot of evolution over the years. Mm-hmm. I was one, as far as I know, maybe somebody said it earlier, I just don't know, but I coined the term subtle energies back in the late 70s, and I look at it now, and to my great shame, because I don't think it has anything to do with energy. Mm-hmm. Healing is almost always described and discussed in the context of sending energy.
Yes.
You're sending something.
Right. People think of it as a form of psychokinesis.
Yes.
Psychokinesis on a living system.
Yes. I don't think that's what's going on at all. Of course, I also think psychokinesis is not what people think it is. I believe that what we're looking at is a linkage at the non-local level in which the healer awakens through this linkage the recipient to produce what amounts to a placebo effect. And I say that because we know what the human brain is capable of generating in terms of energy. It's collectively, you have about 80 billion neurons, and about 1% are firing at any given moment. So those, at any given moment, you have about enough power in your brain to light a single tiny little LED bulb.
Right.
So how is it possible that people could send healing thousands of miles away? We know that we have experimental data. The other nice thing about healing is that there's a great deal of research on it, although it isn't widely known even in the parapsychological community. Although much of the early work was done by parapsychologists, it's now mostly published in the medical literature. But in any case, we know that distance doesn't make any difference.
Yep.
And thanks to a researcher in Israel named Leonard Leibovici, we know that time doesn't make much difference.
In other words, you can heal people in the past?
Yes. And so, given the energy limitations of the brain, and then of course there's the targeting problems.
Yeah.
How do you send some signal out that is not a general signal, but that affects a particular individual who may be thousands of miles away? So the targeting process gets very tricky.
Yeah. Well, we don't yet have a good theoretical model that's where there's consensus agreement. I know you have a model of your own, and that's what we're talking about here, an information model.
Yeah, what I think, when I look at the research, there are, Wayne Jonas, the president of the Samueli Institute, about 2002 or something like that, a few years ago, did a very thorough study, and he found, I think it was 2002 studies that were in the peer-reviewed literature, and evaluated them and found that a large percentage of them met the criteria of any medical treatment. I mean, the court and those sorts of things. So we have a pretty large body of research, and interestingly enough, it covers everything from bacteria and fungi up to high-order mammals. So we have a broad spectrum of targets.
Including plants.
Plants, bacteria, fungi, mice.
Well, let's talk about your work, because you did some interesting studies where you had healers attempt to charge water, and then you did spectrographic analysis of the water and found a measurable physical difference.
Yes, except not charge the water. What I got interested in was, since this was my understanding at that time, since you were dealing with living systems. And one of the criticisms that people advanced about this kind of research was, well, you're dealing with the complexity of a very, sophisticated living system, and so how do you know that the variable that you think you're studying is actually the variable that creates the action? And so I thought, well, let's eliminate the subjective part of it and the complexity of it, and could we find a way of objectively measuring the presence of therapeutic intention through some well-established objective measure, so that those criticisms would be obviated? And the reason I picked water was, again, if you look at it anthropologically, you see that water is associated with healing across thousands of years of human history, and in cultures all over the world. And I tend to believe that when these kinds of empirical sciences develop, like acupuncture or Ayurvedic medicine, for instance, and they develop over hundreds of years and have effectiveness, that close observation demonstrates something is there. So since the association of water was so strong, I thought, well, is there a way that you could measure water?
Yes.
And a British chemist named Douglas Dean had done a very early experiment back in the 60s where he had measured using ultraviolet spectroscopy, and he had found some results, but he was unclear, and he suggested maybe the fundamental frequencies that were involved were not in the ultraviolet range. So I started looking at the spectroscopy literature, because that's a very well-established technique for measuring things. And I talked with Ed Brame, who was the editor of one of the major journals on spectroscopy and was the head of the DuPont Laboratories spectroscopy division, and he suggested that we look at infrared, and thought that, based on other research that had been done, that we might be looking at the HO bonding relationship. H2O. Well, that's one molecule of water, and then another, that's a dimer, and then 3, that's a trimer, and they are linked together through a bond.
Yes.
And so I thought that was pretty sensible. And so we designed an experiment in which we had people do healing using various techniques while they had on the palms of their hand, contained in a cloth tube, little sealed vials, hermetically sealed vials of water, and I had the water made. So that, because there was criticism, well, how do you know it's not some other substance in the water?
Mm-hmm.
Because Dean's work, he had just used tap water.
Yeah.
And so, or in one case he used distilled water, but still not very closely controlled. So I wanted to get rid of that issue as well. So I had a laboratory make the water and put it in these little bottles. And when they did that, then they sent the bottles to us. And so we had 2 measures of controls, which turns out to be important. I just had an idea. I was also struck by the question of, can you create sacred space? Because, again, anthropologically, there is this long tradition that repeated, intentioned consciousness produces sacred space. Anyway, so we had people do healing, and the other question was, are they sending healing? And if you do healing longer, do you send more?
So it wasn't their intention to send healing into the water.
No.
It was they were doing healing of some other sort, and they just happened to be holding these hermetically sealed vials.
Well, they had them held on the palm of the hand through a little cloth tube.
Okay.
So one of the questions was, and one of the hypotheses tested was, does greater healing time produce greater healing? So we had a 5-minute vial, a 10-minute vial, and a 15-minute vial. And yes, the water was completely, from the healer's point of view, irrelevant. And also I wanted to know, could people who were trained in healing, had a regular practice of healing, defined themselves as healers, would their results be significantly different than people who were completely naive to healing? So I had 14 healers, 7 of whom were naives and 7 of whom were self-defined as healers. And we had 14 patients who had everything from arthritis to cancer, kidney stones. And we randomly assigned the healers to the recipients. They didn't know each other, never met each other until the moment that they stepped into the room together to do the session. The whole thing, of course, is videotaped. We put, unbeknownst to both healers and recipients, we put one of the control bottles in the room, but hidden. And we had another control bottle, and the bottles were randomly assigned to their 3 conditions: used on the palm of the hand, in the room, in the room where we did the testing. That was the calibration control. And I wanted to see whether there was any difference using infrared spectrophotometry, multiple internal reflection, which is a particular subset of...
So the 3rd condition in the room where you did the testing is not the same as the room where they did the healing.
That's correct.
Okay.
Oh, yes, of course, because then you couldn't test that proposition.
Right. I just wanted to make sure it was clear.
Yeah, so there are 2 rooms.
Yeah.
There's actually 3. The room where they waited before they stepped into the room where the healing took place, and then a 3rd room where we set up the instruments and did the testing. And what we found, I must say, to everybody's surprise, was, first of all, there was no difference between there was a slight, but there was a non-significant difference between the 5-minute vial and the 15-minute vial. They were all within the error bars.
Okay.
So clearly, whatever was happening in 5 minutes or less. And that doing it longer didn't make any difference.
Okay.
That was the first thing.
That's very interesting.
That was very interesting.
And that's a measurement with regard to the water itself.
Yes. So
not with regard to the people who came for healing.
No. Let's put the people aside for a moment. We'll get to them in a second.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about the water. So what happened was, one researcher and each researcher is blind to what all the other researchers are doing. And of course, the healer and the recipient are completely blind to all of the rest of it. Mm-hmm. So the researcher who was in charge of running the session, the healee would go in and lie on a massage table, and then the healer would enter the room, and the researcher would put the little vial of water on the palm of their hand and step out of the room. First, he would put the control vial, hide the control vial so they couldn't see it, and then when he was ready, we had lights. Then the healer would come into the room, and he would put the thing on the healer's palm, and then he would step out of the room. And the healers used, well, the naives in the practice, they used everything from evangelical Christianity to Buddhism to nothing at all. I mean, no philosophical construct or context at all. They just, the intention.
Yeah.
And they would do it for 5 minutes. Then the researcher who ran the room would come in, take off the 5-minute vial, put on the next vial, and then they would continue the healing. The only thing the healers were told, they could use any technique they wanted. They could not manipulate the patient. Mm-hmm. That is, they might have brushed their body, but they were not to touch them. So they're basically people running their hands over and again, to make sure that happened, all of this is videoed. And then after 10 minutes more, the same thing would happen. The researcher would step into the room. He would take off the 10-minute vial and replace it with the next vial for 15 minutes, and then he would go out. And at the end of the experiment, both would get up and leave the room.
So each session ran about half an hour, I guess.
Yes, between half hour and 40 minutes, yes. Mm-hmm. And then in order to make sure that the measurement researcher, and I wanted to also see, does the person taking the measurement have an effect? And so I had 2 spectroscopists. Mm-hmm. And they each operated and every single vial was measured by each spectroscopist, and each spectroscopist was literally not in the building at the time that the other one was doing it. Mm-hmm. So they are completely also blind.
Yes.
And the instrument was taken apart and completely cleaned, because one critic had said to me, well, if you were to produce a change in the water, which I don't think you will, unless you cleaned all the water off, how do you know that the next water wouldn't be contaminated?
Yes.
So the way we dealt with that was they literally took the instrument apart and cleaned it so that it was completely dry. Uh-huh. We also monitored barometric pressure, and we monitored temperature to see whether that might make a difference. It doesn't. Anyway, so then and in order to make sure that there was no cueing about the positioning of the vials, I created a styrofoam circle with the holes where the vials went. The vials are all numbered.
Yes.
And so when the researcher who ran the room, he would then go down the hall to another part of the building, and he would leave the little disc with the vials, the 3 treated vials and the control vial. And he would leave them in a place, and then he would leave, and he would notify, we had a linkage set up, he would notify the first spectroscopist so that there was no cueing or body language or anything between them, if in case something remarkable happened that the first researcher saw, that he would somehow cue the measurement, the spectroscopist. Yes. So they never saw each other. So he would leave the little disc, go back, alert the first spectroscopist. The first spectroscopist would come into the building. He would go to where the disc was with the vials, take them into the lab, and do the measurements. And also, he had another vial, which one for each thing, that he would measure the calibration vial that had no exposure in the healing room.
Right.
And so the question was, is there a significant difference in the HO bonding relationship between the treated vials, the accession vial, and the calibration control vial?
Yes.
So what we discovered was there was a very significant difference in the bonding relationship between the 5, 10, and 15-minute vials, no difference. There was significant difference between the treated vials and the calibration control, and there was a significant difference between the session room control and the calibration control. Then the first spectroscopist would put all of his vials in a locked file cabinet, walk out, and he would then notify the second spectroscopist who would come into the room. The machine has now been completely cleaned. He would go get the vials, and he would do the whole thing all over again. There was no inter-spectroscopist difference. There was no difference between men and women. There was no difference between the 5, 10, and 15-minute vials. There was a difference between the calibration control and the session room control, suggesting that what was happening was somehow literally altering the informational space of the session room.
Because you're not really changing the H2O molecule, it's still H2O.
Oh, yes, it's still water. It has to do with this bonding relationship between the molecules of water.
As I recall from your study, the way it was expressed, and I know molecules are really very complex, it had to do with the angular relationship in the bond itself?
No, the strength. There are two theories in infrared infrared spectrophotometry. One is that these bonds, these covalent bonds, break and reform, and the other model is that they weaken and strengthen. And there is no agreement in spectroscopy as to which is the dominant model on that. So what we can't say whether they break and reform or whether they strengthen and weaken, because the limitation of the technique is...
But something quite physical is going on.
Yeah, well, no, there's one more piece to this, and that is we predicted, based on the hypothesis that this was my hypothesis was, which was supported by Ed Brame. I had gone to him and said, well, if they don't change the molecular structure of the water, that is, they don't change it from water to something else, then there must be something that I had been studying it. Yes. There must be something that changes in the way this bonding works. And he said, well, that's what I think as well. I think what we're looking at. So that occurs at a very specific wave number. So we were not randomly searching. We looked specifically. Our hypothesis was that at a very specific frequency of wave numbers that which relate to this bonding relationship, that the water bonds would alter either by forming and breaking or by strengthening and weakening, but that it was at a particular place. And in fact, what we found in all the spectra of all the bottles was that it always occurred in exactly the same place, exactly as so that hypothesis was confirmed.
Yes.
The hypothesis about time and intensity of effect was not confirmed. The hypothesis about naives and experienced practitioners, both the naives independently, overall the experiment was quite significant. Each of the population of healers, independently, the naives and the practiced, were independently significant, and there was a difference between the naives and the practiced. So the conclusions are that therapeutic intention, when it is done in the presence of water, the water was not the target, the water was just... when it is done in the presence of water, alters the structure of the water in a predictable way, and that the more practiced you are in expressing intention, the more effect you will produce, but the time in which you produce it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It happens, something is in less than 5 minutes.
And I presume you also monitored the people who came for healing as
yes.
well.
Well, now we can talk about the people.
Yeah.
That was quite extraordinary. In one case, I'll just tell you 2 quick stories about that, because that was really quite amazing. We were not focused on that because of these variability issues I discussed. But in one case, the healer said to the recipient, and we know all this, again, because it was videoed.
Yeah.
There's nobody else present in the room, but the video is sound and all that. He says to the healee, "Oh, you have kidney stones." And healee says, "Yes, I'm going to go in and get treatment for them." And the healer says, "Oh, I think we can take care of that." And so he does that. And I think it was 3 days later, the healee went into the hospital for the procedure where they do the sonic ultrasound bombardment. And it turned out he didn't have kidney stones anymore, but had never passed them.
Oh.
And so that confounded his physicians. But the one that was the most moving, and that really stays with me through the years with this, one of the healers was a fundamentalist Christian.
Yeah.
And he was very homophobic and very judgmental about homosexuals. Had a big, serious attitude about this. And in the random assignment of healer and healee, he was assigned to a professional dancer who was a homosexual.
Like a drag queen?
No, but he was gay.
Okay.
And he was a dancer. He was a professional dancer.
Okay.
And he was HIV positive.
Oh my.
And had begun to manifest AIDS. And this was before the cocktail. So I mean, when and
at a time when AIDS was much more serious than it is
much more
today.
serious and scarier.
Yeah.
Particularly for people who were already fearful about
Yeah, people didn't want to go near them.
LGBT people. Yes, already scary. The protocol required that the healer and the healee know nothing about one another. But we really wrestled with that, and we felt that ethically it would not be ethically correct not to tell this fundamentalist Christian that the man he was going to heal was not only a homosexual, but that he had AIDS. And that because I was going to give him the option to drop out of the experiment, and I would find somebody else to replace him. And to his credit, we told him this, and he was quite stricken about it. It's hard to remember this now, but I mean, people were really freaked out about AIDS.
I do remember.
And fundamentalist Christians were particularly freaked out about AIDS.
I was myself in that era. My wife had a hairdresser who had AIDS, and I asked her, "Do you really think you should be letting him work on your hair?" And she said, "Yeah, no problem." And so I went along with it, but I was concerned.
Yes, I mean, so you can get, then you understand. I mean, so he was considerably unmanned by this. And he said, leave me alone for a minute. And he went into the healing room. And we happened to know this because the video ran the whole time this thing was going. And you could see him in the video walking up and down and talking to himself. "Oh, should I do this? Can I do this? What would Jesus do?" Blah. I mean, he was really, there was a struggle. I mean, I took it very seriously. It was a real existential problem. Finally, he comes out of the healing room and he says to me, "I'm going to do it," which I thought was very brave. And I had a lot of respect for that guy. Anyway, so then we notified the healee, who was in another place, that he could come into the building and go into the room where the healing was going to take place. And he gets up, and people don't remember again very much, but one of the things that people who had AIDS developed was a kind of arthritis where it was very hard for them to move. And of course, for a professional dancer, I mean, that's the end of your career. And and he comes into the room, and he looks at the massage table, and you can see in his face, how am I going to get from here to there? And finally, he works out in his mind how he's going to do it, because his body is his professional instrument, and he puts his hands on the massage table, and he very, very obviously, painfully, climbs onto the table and then sort of flops back on his back. And he's lying there, and then the healer comes in, and they meet for the first time, and the researcher comes in, puts the bottle on, and they start the process. And as they're going along, they start talking. And he said, the healer says, what's really bothering you? And the Healy says, well, I've got these Kaposi sarcomas that are forming, but the thing that really bothers me is I can't get warm. I just cannot get warm. I'm constantly cold. I get into hot bathtubs, but I just, for a minute it's okay, but I get out and I'm just cold. It was because his circular system was breaking down. And he said, I can't tell you how uncomfortable that is to constantly be cold. Your hands, he said, everything feels cold. And my partner does the best he can. He tucks me up with quilts, but I just can't get warm. If you could just do that, I'd be really appreciative. And so he says, well, we'll see. Now, this was a naive healer. He had never done healing in his entire life.
I see.
In fact, had to go talk to his pastor to see if it wasn't witchcraft, and if it was not satanic, and it was okay for him to do it. And he was told, if you do it in Jesus' name, it'll be okay. So he's doing the healing, right? He's going back and forth. And they're talking, and we go through the 3 vials. By this time, tears are coursing down the cheeks of both men. They're just the tears are just running down their faces. And they finish. And the researcher comes in, he takes the last vial off. I don't know if I can tell this story. And he goes out of the room, and these 2 men are left alone. The healer steps back to allow, because it wasn't a very big room, steps back to allow this man to get off the table. And he jumps off the table, and he walks across the room, and he looks down at his feet and his legs, and he does, I can't do it, a little dance step. And his face is just wreathed in smiles. And he does this kind of little dance step back to the healer, and puts his arms around him, and they hug each other. They're both crying, and he says, I can't thank you enough. And he walks out without, he had come in with this kind of very stiff, awkward kind of movement, and he walks out. And you can see what he must have been like when and so he goes, and it changed the life of the healer, completely changed his life. Anyway, we followed up with the Heelys for several months because we were doing a kind of longitudinal study, and we got a letter. We checked in, and we got a note back and called from the man's partner, and he said, well, he died last week, and from the AIDS. And he said, there just wasn't anything that could be done. He said, but I cannot thank you enough. He was warm right up to the end. He was never cold again. I think that was one of the most extraordinary research experiences I've ever had, anyway. And it showed really what we're talking about when we talk about healing. Now,
Well, you know what, Stephen? This is fascinating. It's really fascinating, but we've gone on for quite a while. So what I'd like to do, we'll end now, and we'll do a part 2.
Okay.
So that we can go into even greater depth. So
Okay.
Thank you so much for being with me for
Thank
this.
you for asking me to tell the story.
This has been great.
Yeah.
And thank you for being with us. And check the New Thinking Aloud program listings for part 2 of the series with Stephen Schwartz on healing intention.